Let's move on to God and us, God's freedom and human freedom. It's a similar story if we move from God and the world to God and humans. If I am here in this space, God can't be here also. We either push each other out or we merge in some way. Again, it's a short step to saying the more God is active among us, the less room we will have to be ourselves. Starkly put, the more of God, the less of us. And the more of us, the less of God. Little wonder that some of the most virulent currents of modern atheism trade on just this model. You scratch behind the surface with Dawkins, Hitchens, and co., you will find something like this going on. Feuerbach, a kind of doyen of atheists and modernity, famously wrote, "To enrich God, man must become poor. That God might be all, man must be nothing." Unquote. Well, clearly that's unacceptable. We don't want to be nothing. We want to be something. So this God must go. God is a mighty obstacle if we are to be free. Indeed, his mightiness is a large part of the problem. The biblical God, it is thought, the infinite God of coercive power, this deity of sovereign tyranny, is to be jettisoned in order that we can move into that space that we've given over to God and recover our diminished or displaced dignity. The late and great Colin Gunton speaks of the drive in modernity towards what he calls the displacement of God. The word is very telling, the displacement of God. This, of course, brings us face to face with modernity's most cherished notions of freedom. In so-called libertarian theories, freedom is essentially freedom from. To describe freedom is, first of all, to describe a process of removing external obstacles and constraints, to speak of what we are to be freed from. Along with this, the assumption is that freedom names the power of choice. Maximize your choice, and you maximize freedom. To maximize the choices open to you is to increase your freedom. This means generally freedom of opportunity and freedom of consumer choice, and very often both together. As we all know, the more brands of coffee you have to choose from, the freer you will be. Taking these two strands together, then freedom names the power of unobstructed choice. Even more crudely, freedom names the ability to do otherwise. Humans here in this picture become eventually godlike figures with a potentially infinite space, with the ability to create out of nothing, to act out of nothing, with, in principle, no limits to what they can do and no limits to their progress. What about God and us? God's freedom and human freedom. No longer need we think of God's freedom and our freedom as inherently competitive, struggling for the same space, but rather of what Catherine Tanner of Chicago calls, shortly to be at Yale, calls God's productive agency. God freeing us to be the people we were created to be. The divine project is to rehumanize us, not dehumanize us. If you've never heard that before, you happen to be here tonight out of interest, as it were, from outside the church or whatever. If you've never heard that before, I do hope you hear that. The divine project is to rehumanize, not dehumanize. And here the language of balance or compromise, wonderfully English as it is, has little place, as if God, so to speak, did 50% and we did the rest. Theologies of salvation often try to work like that. God does his bit, comes halfway across the bridge, and we run halfway to meet him, suddenly out of our own power, extraordinarily enough. But when one string sets and off another, do they each do 50% of the work and meet in the middle? When a person comes to faith, I would suggest the New Testament model is not so much like walking over a bridge to meet God halfway, but much more akin to the upper string freeing the lower one. Freedom is about being enabled by God to share through the resonating agency of the Spirit in God's own resonance. That is our freedom. So many of the so-called Calvinist versus Arminian debates, if you're into these things in theology, so many of them presuppose basically a visual conception of space. And a lot of them, I think, are actually unnecessary. I'm not saying everything just dissolves away, all difficulties dissolve away, but it looks, or rather sounds, very different when you hear it through the world of sound.